The mountain wind howled through the ancient pines, carrying with it the bitter chill of approaching winter. Damian Reed adjusted his pack, his weathered hands gripping the straps as he navigated the treacherous path. 10 years of mountain rescue work had taught him to read these slopes like a book, but today something felt different. The air carried an electric charge that had nothing to do with the brewing storm. He'd left the rescue service 3 months ago, unable to shake the memories of those he couldn't save. The mountains had become his refuge, a place where the silence could drown out the echoes of past failures. But tonight, the silence was broken by something unexpected, a sound that didn't belong among the whispers of wind and creaking branches. The cry was unlike anything he'd ever heard, a harmonic wail that seemed to resonate with the very rocks beneath his feet. Damian froze, his trained ears picking up the direction. East, maybe half a kilometer through the dense forest. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, to ignore it, but 15 years of running toward danger instead of away from it had left their mark. The storm was gathering strength, the first heavy drops of rain beginning to fall as Damian pushed through the undergrowth. The cry came again, closer now, accompanied by a softer sound, something that reminded him of a child's whimper. He picked up his pace, letting his experience guide him safely across the increasingly treacherous ground. The source of the sound became clear as he rounded a massive boulder. In a shallow cave formed by fallen rocks, 2 figures huddled together. Damian's breath caught in his throat. The larger figure was unmistakably female, but her skin was a deep indigo that seemed to ripple with bioluminescent patterns. Her eyes, large and entirely silver, fixed on him with a mixture of fear and desperation. In her arms, she clutched a smaller being. A child, Damian realized, whose skin showed the same shifting patterns, but in softer, more muted tones. The adult alien. There was no other word for what she clearly was injured. A deep gash ran along her side, seeping a phosphorescent fluid that glowed faintly in the growing darkness. The child appeared unharmed, but was shivering violently, whether from fear or cold. Damian couldn't tell. "Easy," Damian said softly, holding his hands up in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peace. "I'm not here to hurt you." He kept his voice low and steady, the same tone he'd used countless times to calm panicked climbers and lost hikers. The alien mother's silver eyes narrowed, but there was intelligence in that gaze, and after a moment, she nodded slowly. She spoke, her voice producing sounds that seemed to layer over each other like harmonies in music. Though the words were incomprehensible, the meaning was clear in the way she gestured to her wound and then to her child. Damian set his pack down carefully and pulled out his first aid kit. "I can help," he said, pointing to her injury, "but you'll have to trust me." He took a slow step forward, then another, watching for any sign of fear or aggression. The alien mother remained still, though her arms tightened protectively around her child. As Damian knelt beside them, the storm broke in earnest. Rain hammered against the rocks, and thunder rolled through the valleys. The child flinched at each crash, burying its face in its mother's chest. Working quickly but gently, Damian cleaned the wound as best he could. The alien's blood seemed to react to his touch, the glow intensifying slightly where his fingers made contact. "You can't stay here," he said, more to himself than to them. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and the shallow cave offered little protection from the wind that was now driving the rain sideways. The alien mother seemed to understand his concern. She attempted to stand but stumbled, weakness evident in her movements. Damian made a decision then, one that would change everything. "There's a ranger station," he said, pointing through the trees. 2 kilometers. Shelter, medical supplies, heat. He minded walking, then sleeping, trying to convey his meaning through gestures. The alien studied him for a long moment, her silver eyes seeming to peer into his soul. Finally, she nodded again, more decisively this time. She allowed Damian to help her to her feet, the child still cradled in her arms. As they began their slow journey through the storm, Damien couldn't shake the feeling that he had just stepped into something far bigger than a simple rescue. The wind rose to a howl around them, and in the distance, a light flashed that wasn't lightning. For better or worse, Damien Reed's solitary exile in the mountains had come to an end. Now he had to ensure they all survived what was coming. The ranger station emerged from the darkness like a ghost, its weathered walls barely visible through the curtain of rain. Damien shouldered the door open, ushering his unusual companions inside. The alien mother, who had managed to communicate through gestures that her name was Naira, immediately scanned the room, her silver eyes reflecting the beam of Damien's flashlight like mirrors. The station was basic but secure. One room with a small kitchen area, a few bunks, and most importantly, a wood stove. Damien worked quickly to start a fire, aware of how Naira and her child trembled from the cold. The young one, Ta, as Naira had indicated, watched his every move with undisguised fascination, making soft trilling sounds that seemed to echo in the small space. As warmth began to fill the room, Damien turned his attention back to Naira's wound. In the better light, he could see that the injury was worse than he'd initially thought. The glowing fluid, blood, he assumed, had formed crystalline patterns around the edges of the gash. Naira winced as he cleaned it more thoroughly, but made no sound of pain. "I wish I knew what happened to you," Damien muttered, more to break the silence than anything else. To his surprise, Naira responded by pressing her palm against his forehead. The contact sent a jolt through his mind, and suddenly images began to flood his consciousness. A ship, sleek and organic, unlike anything human engineering could produce. A desperate escape. Pursuit by others of her kind, but different. Their bioluminescent patterns harsh and angular compared to Naira's flowing ones. A crash in the mountains. Running, hiding, protecting Ta at all costs. Damien gasped as Naira broke the connection. "You're refugees," he said softly, understanding dawning in his eyes. Naira nodded, then gestured to Ta, who had curled up near the fire. She touched her chest, then made a series of flowing movements with her hands. Through residual impressions from their mental contact, Damien understood. Ta was special, different in a way that made him both precious and hunted. The night deepened around them as Damien shared his meager supplies. Dried food and water. Ta approached the offerings cautiously at first, but soon began to eat with obvious relief. The child's bioluminescent patterns shifted to warmer hues, which Damien took as a good sign. As Tao ate, Naira attempted to explain more through a combination of gestures and brief mental touches. Her people were divided, she conveyed. Some, like her, believed in peaceful coexistence and exploration. Others sought to maintain racial purity and technological superiority. Ta represented something that threatened their ideology: natural evolution, adaptation, change. And Earth? Damien asked, mimicking the globe with his hands. Naira's expression darkened. More images flashed between them. Her people watching Earth, debating its fate. Some saw humans as primitive, dangerous. Others, like Naira, saw potential. Tao was living proof that their species could adapt, evolve, perhaps even coexist. A sudden gust of wind rattled the station's windows, making them all jump. Ta scurried to his mother's side, his patterns pulsing with anxiety. Damien checked his satellite phone. Still no signal, not that he was sure who he would call even if he could. This wasn't exactly a situation the Mountain Rescue Service was equipped to handle. As the night wore on, Damien found himself sharing stories of his own, not sure if Naira could understand his words, but feeling compelled to fill the silence. He told them about his years in mountain rescue, the lives saved and lost, the solitude he'd sought in these peaks. Naira listened intently, her silver eyes never leaving his face, occasionally touching his hand to share impressions of understanding. Tao, growing bolder, began to explore the station. The child's natural curiosity seemed to overcome any fear, and soon he was investigating everything within reach. His movements were graceful, almost hypnotic, his patterns shifting with each new discovery. When he found Damien's compass, his excitement manifested as pulses of light that danced across his skin. "Your boy," Damien said to Naira, watching Tao experiment with the compass's magnetic pull. "He sees the world differently, doesn't he? That's part of why they're hunting you." Naira's response was a complex series of pattern changes across her skin, but the emotion behind it was clear: pride mixed with fierce protectiveness. A distant rumble, different from thunder, made them all freeze. Naira's patterns shifted to darker hues, and she quickly gathered Ta close. Damien moved to the window, peering out into the storm. For a moment, he thought he saw lights in the sky, moving with purpose rather than drifting like stars. They weren't safe here, he realized. The station was too exposed, too obvious. As if reading his thoughts, Naira placed her hand on his shoulder. The image she shared was clear: a network of caves, deep in the mountains, where her ship had crashed. Somewhere they might have a chance to hide, to plan their next move. Damien checked his watch. 2 hours until dawn. They would have to move fast, and the storm wasn't letting up. But as he looked at Tao's innocent face and Naira's determined expression, he knew there was no other choice. He had already decided to help them. Now he had to commit fully to whatever consequences that decision might bring. Dawn broke over the mountains in shades of gray, the storm having passed, but leaving behind a thick blanket of mist. Damien led Naira and Ta through the treacherous terrain, his years of mountain experience guiding them along hidden paths and natural shortcuts. The aliens' bioluminescence had dimmed to near invisibility, an adaptation that Naira had indicated was defensive. The first sign of pursuit came 3 hours into their journey. A low-frequency hum vibrated through the rocks, causing loose stones to shift and rattle down the slopes. Ta clutched his mother's hand tighter, his free hand gripping the compass Damien had given him like a talisman. Above them, something large moved through the cloud cover, its shadow barely visible through the mist. "Down," Damien whispered, pulling them beneath an overhanging rock face. The shadow passed overhead, accompanied by pulses of energy that made the air crackle. Naira's patterns flickered in recognition, and through a brief touch to Damien's wrist, she shared a glimpse of their pursuers, the guardians, self-appointed protectors of her species' genetic purity. They waited in tense silence until the humming faded, then continued their careful progress toward the cave network, where Naira's ship lay hidden. Damien's mind raced, trying to formulate a plan. The crashed ship might offer shelter, but it would also be an obvious target. They needed something else, something unexpected. As they climbed higher, the air grew thinner, and their progress slowed. Naira's wound, though partially healed, still troubled her. Ta, showing remarkable resilience for one so young, kept pace without complaint, his attention divided between watching their surroundings and studying the compass in his hands. Near midday, they reached a narrow pass between two peaks. Damien held up his hand, signaling a stop. Something wasn't right. Years of rescue work had honed his instincts, and right now, they were screaming danger. The mist ahead seemed thicker, more concentrated, moving against the wind. A burst of artificial fog erupted from hidden emitters in the rocks, and 3 figures materialized from the haze. They were similar to Naira in basic form, but their bioluminescent patterns were rigid, geometric, pulsing with aggressive reds and yellows. Their eyes glowed with an intense silver light that seemed almost mechanical. The leaders stepped forward, addressing Naira in their musical language. Though Damien couldn't understand the words, the tone was clear: surrender or else. Naira's response was immediate and defiant, her patterns flaring with protective fury as she pushed Ta behind her. One of the guardians raised a device that hummed with the same energy they'd felt earlier. Damien acted on instinct, years of mountain rescue work translating into split-second decision-making. He grabbed a handful of loose rocks and threw them high, triggering a minor avalanche that forced the guardians to dodge. "Run," he shouted, grabbing Tao's hand. They sprinted back the way they'd come, then veered sharply onto a smaller trail that Damien had noticed earlier. Behind them, the Guardians recovered quickly, their pursuit accompanied by bursts of energy that scorched the rocks where they struck. Damien led them through increasingly narrow and treacherous paths, using his knowledge of the mountain to their advantage. The Guardians, clearly unused to such terrain, began to fall behind. But they weren't safe yet. The humming of their ship grew louder again, the shadow passing overhead with increasing frequency. They reached a sheer cliff face, seemingly a dead end. But Damien smiled grimly. "Trust me," he said to Naira, pointing to a nearly invisible crack in the rock. It was one of the mountain's secrets, a passage he'd discovered years ago during a particularly difficult rescue. Naira understood, quickly ushering Ta into the narrow opening. The passage twisted downward, barely wide enough for them to squeeze through. As they descended into darkness, Naira's bioluminescence provided just enough light to see by. Above them, the sounds of pursuit grew fainter. The cave system stretched like a labyrinth beneath the mountain, its twisting corridors illuminated by the soft glow of crystal formations and Naira's bioluminescence. Damien led them deeper, following paths that grew increasingly complex. Behind them, distant echoes suggested the Guardians had found the entrance and were beginning their pursuit. Tao's compass, which had been spinning erratically since they entered the caves, suddenly steadied, pointing with unwavering certainty toward a passage Damien had never explored. The child tugged at his hand, trilling softly but insistently. Naira touched Damien's shoulder, sharing a flash of understanding. Tao's unique sensitivity, the very thing that made him a target, was guiding them to something important. They followed the child's lead, descending through chambers filled with crystals that seemed to pulse in harmony with Naira and Tao's own patterns. The air grew warmer, charged with an energy that made Damien's skin tingle. Finally, they emerged into a vast cavern where crystals of unprecedented size jutted from floor to ceiling. Naira's reaction was immediate and profound. Her patterns shifted through a complex sequence of colors as she moved to the center of the chamber. Through another quick mental touch, she shared her discovery. This place was a natural amplifier, similar to the communication technology her people used. With the right resonance, they might be able to send a signal far beyond Earth. But before they could act on this revelation, the Guardians caught up. 3 of them entered the chamber from different passages, their geometric patterns harsh against the natural crystal formations. Their leader spoke again, the musical language now carrying threatening undertones that echoed through the cavern. Damien positioned himself between the Guardians and his companions, acutely aware of how inadequate his human strength might be against their advanced technology. But he learned something in his years of rescue work. Sometimes the most powerful force wasn't strength or technology, but simple, unwavering determination. The confrontation exploded into chaos when one of the Guardians fired their energy weapon. Damien dove for cover, pulling Ta with him as the blast struck a crystal formation, shattering it into thousands of glowing shards. The crystals throughout the chamber began to resonate, their vibrations building to a painful intensity. What happened next would forever change Damien's understanding of the universe. Ta, instead of cowering in fear, stood tall in the center of the chamber. His bioluminescent patterns began to pulse in perfect harmony with the crystals, creating waves of energy that rippled through the air. The compass in his hand spun wildly, then exploded in a shower of sparks. The Guardians staggered, their own patterns disrupted by the frequencies Ta was generating. Naira added her own resonance to her son's, their combined energy making the very air shimmer. The crystals amplified their signal, sending it racing through the earth and up into space. The cave filled with light so intense that Damien had to shield his eyes. When he could see again, the Guardians had collapsed, their rigid patterns now flowing in softer, more natural rhythms. Through their shared mental connection, Naira explained, Ta hadn't just sent a signal. He had demonstrated the very evolution the Guardians feared, proving that adaptation and change were not just possible but necessary. The response came faster than any of them expected. A new ship, larger than the Guardian's vessel, descended through the mountain's peak, its energy somehow phasing through solid rock. Its crew, when they arrived in the chamber, bore patterns similar to Nairis, flowing, adaptive, alive with possibility. In the days that followed, as Nairis people began to heal their divisions and embrace change, Damien found himself pulled into a world larger than he'd ever imagined. The Mountain Rescue Service would have to find someone else to handle their emergencies. He had a new purpose now, helping to bridge the gap between two species, teaching and learning in equal measure. Tao, growing stronger and more assured each day, became a symbol of hope for both humans and aliens. His unique ability to connect with Earth's natural energies opened new paths of understanding between the two species. And if sometimes, on quiet nights, people reported seeing strange lights dancing above the mountains, well, that was just part of the new reality. As for Damien, he finally understood why he'd been drawn to these peaks all those years ago. Some people were meant to build bridges, not just between mountains, but between worlds. The solitude he'd sought had led him not to isolation, but to the greatest connection of all. The realization that in this vast universe, no one had to face the darkness alone.